think we can get started here. Continuing on with our series called After Dark. And we've kind of been moving chronologically through the patriarchs here. We started with Abram, with the cutting of a deal with Abram after dark. And then last week we looked at Jacob's wrestling match with the unknown assailant there. And I still don't have an answer for you, by the way, as to which one I think it is. Brandy and I were talking last Sunday morning after the service, and she's pretty convinced it's Esau. But, if you think it's something else, that's cool too. So Jacob's wrestling match, and then just to kind of remind you of how the history goes through the book of Genesis into Exodus, you've got Joseph, who was the next to youngest son of Jacob, and through a series of events, him being sold into slavery, and then there being a famine, and all those kind of things, he ends up bringing his entire family to Egypt. But then a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph came along, and so all of the people in Joseph's family, which were starting to grow at this point, they all became slaves. And so then there was 400 years of slavery in Egypt for the people of God, the people of Israel, or the Hebrews, which I kind of use those names interchangeably. And so there's 400 years of slavery, and then you get to Moses and the Exodus. And, there's a couple of after dark stories about Moses, and for one day, actually it was a very short day, it was more like 2 hours, I played around with the idea of doing the story that maybe you know or maybe you don't, that happens after dark, where Moses and his family are kind of in a tent, and not unlike the story of Jacob, an unknown assailant comes. A lot of people automatically think it was God, but then Jewish commentators say no, it was either an angel or Satan or some kind of serpent that comes and attacks Moses in his tent and is trying to kill him. And to save him, his wife, in the dark, mind you, circumcises her son with a flint knife. And I thought about doing that one this week. In the dark, yes, in the dark with a very dull rock knife. Yeah, that's the story of Zipporah. Watch out if you end up in a tent with Zipporah, watch out. But I thought about doing that one for about 2 hours, and then I was like, I have nowhere to go with this. I have lots of places I could go with this, but I really have nowhere to end with this, and so I decided to do, Andrew, I don't need your opinion on that. There's lots of places, but I did want to do something with Moses and the dark, and so I settled on something that we're going to get into here in just a second. So Moses, in the story, if you'll remember, he's been charged by God to go to Pharaoh and convince Pharaoh to let the people go, to let the Hebrews, the people of Israel who have been enslaved for these 400 years, to let them go. And so when Pharaoh refuses, Moses starts sending these plagues, right? There are all these plagues that are unleashed on Egypt, and they're designed to kind of force Pharaoh to let the people go. And so throughout this process, Pharaoh's heart's hardened. He kind of will give in for a little bit, and then he's like, oh no, I changed my mind. And so his heart has been hardened through 8 plagues. And now we're going to get to number 9, and that's where we're going to pick up our story today in Exodus chapter 10, starting in verse 21. And then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived. So I have to admit to you, I never understood this plague. I've never really understood it until I've really studied it this week, because especially when you look at this plague kind of in relation to the other plagues, the plagues kind of get worse as they go along. And so all of a sudden, here we are at 9. They've been increasing in intensity as they've gone along. And so, the first 8 were pretty rough. And then you get to 9, and it's like, okay, darkness. And I think about darkness, and it's like, okay, it's dark. No big whoop, right? It's like, okay, so I get a longer nap. I mean, it's easier to sleep. And, so it's like, okay, what's the big deal? So it was dark. And, how is this any worse than the stuff that they had before? Lice and locusts and, rivers turning to blood and, all sorts of things. How is darkness worse than those things? How does this one come in at number 9 before, the one right before the worst one, number 10? How does this one come in at number 9? And I never really understood it. I never understood what the big deal was. Although we've been saying throughout this series that darkness was a bigger deal to the ancients. And I say this over and over again. It's a little dark in here tonight. The sun's going down and things like that. But we don't know dark the way they knew dark. I'll say that over and over and over again. We don't really understand how dark it can get in places where there's no electricity, where there's no other kind of sources of light. And so the ancients, darkness was a bigger deal to them. But still, even then, it's kind of like, okay, well, what's the big deal? Well, let me say, this was a big deal. And so one of the things that a lot of people looking at this particular plague now, what they think that this probably was a very strong sandstorm. They have very strong sandstorms in Egypt, and they have the ability, because there's so much sand blowing around, to block out the sun. And so this is something that very easily could have happened. And they also say, scientists that look at these kind of things also say, because of the plagues that went before all of this, the destruction of the crops and some other things, that it's very possible that this sandstorm could have been even more intense because there was nothing to block it. There weren't the normal things to block it, and so it may have lasted longer. It could have been intensified. Another thing about this kind of sandstorm, because of where the Nile is and all that kind of stuff, this storm sometimes, not unlike what happened in Houston, kind of gets stuck in this one area. And when it gets stuck around the Nile, it has the tendency to pull water up in it. And so not only is there sand blowing around, but there's also like this heavy kind of humid moisture. And, any of you who have lived anywhere where it's humid, which I have, living in Texas and living in Delaware and things like that, when it's really humid, it's heavy. And you can kind of feel it. I mean, you can just feel the moisture in the air. And so there was this physical kind of thing. And remember, the passage said that it was a darkness that could be felt. And so that's very possible. What is being described here may be this sandstorm, which, as you know, have you ever been in any? Of course you have. Where do we live? Yeah, I mean, we know what this is like every spring, right? It gets brown. It gets brown around here. Maybe not dark, but it gets brown around here. And there was a big sandstorm when I first moved here. I moved here in May of 2002, again, a long time ago. And I remember my sister had been here to help me kind of move in and all that kind of thing. And they were leaving. They were on their way to go back to Colorado Springs. And one of these sandstorms came up. And I didn't have a car yet. And I was having to walk from my house to the car dealership down on one of those roads. San Juan, I don't know. Anyway, and so I remember getting pelted with the sand, and I was like, what have I done? What have I done? Moving to this God-forsaken place. It's brown, and I'm getting pelted with sand. So yeah, blowing sand can be felt, right? And then you add on that humidity and that moisture in the air, and you can kind of understand this darkness that can be felt. It would have been a physical phenomenon that they would have felt during this, but it would have been more than just a physical thing. That wasn't, okay, so you're like, all right, yeah, this is getting worse, this darkness thing. It's not just good for napping now. I can feel it. It's physical, but it was more than just that. Each of the plagues, as they went through, each of the plagues attacked a god of Egypt. Egypt was a polytheistic kind of place. They had lots of different gods. And so you can see it as you trace the plagues, how each of the plagues were attacking different gods, kind of to say, as God was saying, you think this God is in control? No, I'm the one in control. And so for this particular plague, the god that was being attacked was Ra, who was the sun god. And he was the primary deity. He was kind of the top of the food chain as their deities went. And the mythology around Ra was, number one, he was like the creator. He was the god who created things and brought things to life, and not, it's kind of easy to see where there's some parallels here. He was the God who brought light, which then brought life, which then brought creation, which is not unlike our creation story as well. But also part of the mythology around Ra was that every night he was swallowed up by darkness, and then every morning he was reborn to bring life. That was the way the mythology went. So you can imagine for these people who have been following this mythology all of their life and worshiping Ra, and suddenly for 3 days they can't see the sun anymore. It would have brought them into a little bit of panic and a little bit of chaos, because their thought process would have been that Ra has been swallowed up, and this time he's not being reborn. Ra is gone. He has left us. What are we going to do without this deity? And so no morning light leads them to believe that Ra is completely gone, which sends them into a little bit of panic, which gives them a great deal of fear. So it's not just a physical issue now. It's not just this sand that's hitting them. It's not just this moisture wearing down on them. It's also a religious kind of pressure and kind of intensity here. It's for them to think our God has abandoned us. In the midst of all of this, our greatest God is gone. So you've got a physical reaction, you've got a religious reaction, but you've also got a social reaction here. And this is the part that I think is probably the kind of the tip of the iceberg here that sometimes we miss in the midst of this play. And I just want to kind of remind you, fear makes us individually do crazy things, right? As individuals, when we feel fear, we can do some crazy stuff, right? And some of you guys are like, oh yeah, that's true. But there's more to it than even that. Group fear, plus the anonymity of darkness, makes us do even crazier things, right? We've seen mob mentality. We've seen how that all works, especially when there's this sense of anonymity. And so what you've got in the social realm is you've got a bunch of individuals who are freaking out because things are weird and they're getting physically harmed here, and they believe that their God has abandoned them. And then you kind of get them, as individuals they're afraid, but also as groups they're afraid, and also it's dark, and so there's a little bit of anonymity, and you can just imagine what kind of chaos was happening. And the Midrash, which is Jewish commentary that dates way, way back from the Exodus. What am I thinking of? From the Babylon exile, from then until the time of Jesus, and even today, something called Midrash, which is their commentary, a running commentary on the Old Testament. They have a very interesting concept on this idea of lack of recognition. Remember, it said in the Scripture, it said that they didn't know each other. And you might be like, okay, well, it's so dark, they can't see each other, they weren't sure who each other were. It's a little bit more than that. The Midrash really keys on this idea of lack of recognition. And what they believe, they also kind of stretch this plague out a little bit. When we read it, the way we read it in our English language, we think, okay, this was 3 days. But the Jewish commentators, the way they read Hebrew, they say, no, this was 6 days. There were 3 days of this lack of recognition, and then there were 3 days of no one moving. And so they stretched this out to be 6 days instead of 3 days, which again, more time, more fear, just makes everything worse. And what they say, this lack of recognition, the not knowing one another is more than just not knowing who's standing before them. It's more than just not being able to tell who is right next to them. It's more than that. It's really a not recognizing humanity. Not being able to recognize their brother. Not being able to see the person in front of them as an equal or as human. And you can kind of follow this logic a little bit here. Again, when we get really scared, we go into defense mode, don't we? We go into thinking only of ourselves. And everything and everybody else, especially when you consider darkness, is a threat. And so everybody, even if it was family, if it was friend, if it was someone who normally in the light of day they would have been just fine with, everyone was a threat. And so the Jewish commentators look at this and say that the Egyptians for 3 days actually were treating everybody as if they were slaves. Their brothers. They were treating them the way they had been treating the Hebrew people. And they were rough on their slaves. And so you've got brother against brother. You've got Egyptian on Egyptian violence. We've kind of heard that term somewhere before a little bit. You've got all sorts of things going on with these folks because they didn't recognize each other. And the implication was that fear drove these Egyptians to act less than human towards each other. And you might say, well, that's kind of a stretch. Have you watched the news lately?
Yeah.
Fear, yeah, you quit. That's a good idea. Fear drives us to do really inhumane things. And when you add in the darkness, it makes it even worse. And so there's this mob mentality for 3 days where the Egyptians are kind of getting back what they've been dishing out for the last 400 years. And so the commentators say after 3 days of that, everybody was afraid to leave their houses, where it says that nobody moved, nobody did anything. They were all afraid to leave their homes. They were afraid to even get out of their beds because they might bump into somebody who didn't recognize them, even in their homes. And there would be problems. There would be chaos. And so for 3 days this is going on. Meanwhile, this is the interesting part about this. Meanwhile, the Hebrews still had light in their dwellings. And it's kind of like, well, that's interesting. And, why? Why did they have light when the Egyptians didn't? And there's some ideas here. Some people point to their location in Goshen, which was a little bit further away from the water source. And so maybe, because a lot of commentators say one of the reasons why there was no light was because of the sand blowing in the air and also because of the moisture in the air, they couldn't even, make a fire. And so some would say that maybe it was their distance because, when you're the slaves, you're not real close to the water source. You got to walk a long way. And so maybe it was the fact that they were further away from the water source that they were able to light fires and see one another. I say, okay, maybe. But here's what I think is more likely. I think if we look at the language, we can kind of figure this out a little bit more. There's a couple Hebrew words for light. They've got a couple different ones. And this particular one, the one that's used here, which is or, is it kind of carries along with it a connotation of the supernatural. It's more of an idea of enlightenment rather than light. And so I kind of have this idea, and I'm not alone in this, a lot of commentators believe that what they actually had was hope. That maybe they didn't have physical light, but because they still had hope in them, because their God was not dead. They understood that this was from their God. And so they didn't turn on one another because they still had hope. They recognized their brothers. They still understood all this. Maybe they didn't have physical light, but they were enlightened by hope. And so it's just one of those very interesting little kind of things. And I don't know if you've learned anything tonight, but I have. I've learned a lot about this particular plague. But what does this all have to do with us? I mean, interesting stuff, right? I mean, come on. Hey, I did a lot of research this week, all right? Give me a little credit here. So, but what does it mean? What does it have to do with me? It's like, Melinda, you could have done that circumcision story, and we would have gotten, somewhere. Well, here's what it has to do with us. This plague was a bad one. Have I convinced you? This one was. This was worthy of the number 9 spot, okay? A lot of people want to put it down a little bit further in the top 10 list. No, this one deserved its number 9 ranking. This would have been rough. Very, very rough. And the thing about this plague is it came with no warning. Some of the other plagues had warning. Moses would go to Pharaoh and say, hey, let us go, or this is going to happen. But this one came on with no warning. Here's the thing. I often feel like we are in the midst of a creeping 9th plague, if that makes sense. Instead of just kind of coming all of a sudden where, it's like we have light and then all of a sudden we have darkness, it almost kind of feels like incrementally we're kind of getting darker and darker and darker and darker. And we're starting to see some of the things that happened during this plague. It seems like society is not recognizing each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
it's starting to seem like here we are lining up again for fear, for self-preservation, for focused on us, much like the Egyptians. When fear happens, you start to focus on self-preservation and yourself, and you stop losing interest in other people, especially people who aren't like you, people you don't recognize. And it seems like we're just losing that. We're just not able to recognize each other, and it's almost a lack of humanity where we're seeing some people as not equal and not even human and not worthy and not like us, and so thus a little bit lower. And again, it's happening kind of incrementally. It's getting dark. It's getting very dark. And so loss of hope and fear and lack of recognition is a dangerous cocktail. And again, we've seen this on the news, haven't we? We've seen where things flare up because of these very things. Lack of hope, fear, and a lack of recognition causes people to just be crazy. And you look at it and go, what? How does this happen? Let me tell you how it happens. It's a creeping ninth plague. It's just something that's happening. And the interesting thing is that as you look at the book of Revelation, it's very clear that this is going to happen. Very clear that darkness is one of the things towards the end. Again, darkness is kind of the next to last thing before the last thing. And here we are with this creeping ninth plague. And when Jesus said, "You're the light of the world," I think he was preparing us to be the hope in these days. Because it's getting darker, and we should be shining brighter because we have hope in our dwelling. We have light in our dwellings. We should be the light for this world. It's so necessary right now, but the scary thing is that it's kind of disappearing from some of the places where it needs to be, and we need to be the hope and the light in our dwellings as our home. Oh my goodness, it's so just pertinent for me right now because, I've got one of those people in my house right now that is sometimes looked at as less than others. He's an immigrant. He's African American. And, I posted a couple weeks ago the story about how, someday I'm going to have the talk to him about here's how you do things when you're stopped by the police, or here's how you do things when you find yourself in a group of people who don't recognize you for who you are. And so in my home, I better be the light. I better be hope for my son. And in your homes too, you're not in the same situation as me, but you need to be the light in your homes and be teaching your children and other people to recognize others, whether that be for the difference in skin color, the difference in nationality, the difference in belief system, the difference in sexual orientation or gender identity, whatever that is. Teach your kids to be the hope for those people who are often looked at as less than human or less than in society. In our social circles, we need to be the light. It's hard sometimes, isn't it? It's hard sometimes in our social circles when we hear people talking politically, and we might need to stand up and say, wait, there's hope, there's light. But mostly in our churches. And unfortunately, this is where the light is going out in a lot of places. The light is going out where people are not recognizing others. I got a text. I was telling Andrew this before service. I got a text this week from a freshman saying, "Hey, I've got a couple friends. One is transgender and one is gender binary, and they just got kicked out of their youth group. Is there any room for them at your church?" And I said, "You bet. Because we're going to keep the light on here. And we're going to recognize people as humans, and we are not going to grade people here. As long as I'm your pastor, we will keep the light on for everybody." We're losing the light in our churches. Scary. It's sad. So we're going to go old school here. We can't lose the light. Don't let Satan it out. Y'all know the song? It's getting blown out in a lot of places, in our homes, in our social circles, in our schools, in our jobs, in our churches. Don't let Satan it out. Because the world needs light. The world needs hope. And we're it. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world that dispels the darkness, the creeping darkness that we find ourselves in." Let's pray together. God, this world can be scary. So scary that some of us have stopped